The carpet in the hallway, outside conference room 7B, had a pattern that nobody who worked on the 22nd floor had ever noticed. Dark burgundy diamonds on a cream background, the kind of design that existed purely to hide what accumulated over time. Renee had noticed it on her first week. She had noticed everything on her first week 3 years ago, because noticing things was how she survived. It was 2 in the morning, and the building belonged to her, in the way that buildings only belong to the people who clean them after everyone else has gone home. She pushed her cart through the door of the conference room and started with the windows the way she always did, working left to right, glass cleaner and a microfiber cloth, the Atlanta skyline smearing and then sharpening as she wiped. The table was long enough to seat 14 people. She had counted once. The chairs cost more than her monthly rent. She had looked that up once too on her phone during a break, and then she had stopped looking things up like that because the numbers did not help her. She was on the far end of the table when she saw it. A manila envelope thick, sitting at the head of the table, like it had been placed there deliberately. No name on the front, no label, just an envelope that someone had left behind, or forgotten, or chosen to leave. She picked it up to move it to the credenza, with the other items people left in conference rooms. Phones, pens, the occasional jacket draped over a chair, like its owner planned to return at any moment. But this one was heavy in a way that made her stop. She set it back on the table. She looked at it for a moment, the way you look at something when your instincts are telling you something your brain has not yet caught up to. Then she opened it. The bills were bundled neatly, each stack held with a paper band. She did not count out loud. She had learned to do math quietly a long time ago, in rooms where being seen thinking too hard made people uncomfortable. Her fingers moved through the stacks with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent years handling documents, cross-referencing figures, building cases from paper trails. $80,000. She set the money aside and looked at what was underneath it. A contract. 12 pages, single-spaced, the kind of language that looked like English, but functioned as something else entirely. A system designed to say one thing while meaning another. She had spent 2 years in a paralegal program, learning to read exactly this kind of document. She had graduated. She had passed her certification. And then a background check had taken all of it away, reduced her to a single line in a file that told employers everything about who she had been at 22 and nothing about who she was now. But she still knew how to read a contract. She read it, not all of it. Enough. Enough to understand what the money was for. Enough to understand that whatever was being arranged in this document would not end well for people who had no seat at any table, least of all this one. She stood very still for a moment. The air conditioning hummed. Somewhere below, Atlanta carried on being a city that did not know she existed. Then she took out her phone. Her finger hovered over the screen. The camera app was open. The contract was on the table in front of her, lit by the overhead fluorescents that she had cleaned the covers of 4 months ago, when the maintenance request had finally come through. She pressed the button. The shutter sound was off. She had turned it off a long time ago for reasons that had nothing to do with this moment, and everything to do with not waking her children during the hours when she reviewed case files on her phone in the dark. She photographed 3 pages, the first, the last, and the signature page in between. Then she put her phone back in her pocket. She replaced the contract in the envelope. She placed the money back on top of it, straightened the stacks, the way she had found them, and set the envelope back at the head of the table in the exact position it had occupied when she walked in. From the supply cart, she tore a small strip of paper, the kind used for labeling cleaning solutions. She did not have a notepad. She wrote 3 words in the precise, unhurried handwriting of someone who had once taken notes for attorneys. Found. Room 7B. She folded it once and tucked it under the edge of the envelope where it would be seen by the first person who touched it in the morning. She finished cleaning the room. She wiped down the table, starting from the far end and working back toward the door. She straightened the chairs. She collected what little trash there was. She turned off the lights and pulled the door closed behind her with the quiet click of someone who understood that some rooms required a certain kind of respect, even after hours, even when no one was watching. In the hallway, She pushed her cart toward the elevator. The small red light on the security camera above the elevator doors blinked steadily in the dark, the way it always did, the way she had never had reason to pay attention to before. She did not look up. She never looked up at cameras in hallways. There was no reason to. She had not done anything wrong. The elevator opened. She stepped in. The doors closed behind her. The red light kept blinking. The security footage played on a loop on the monitor mounted in the corner of the 32nd floor office, and the man watching it had not moved in 11 minutes. Victor Haynes had built Haynes and Associates over the course of 30 years into one of the most recognized litigation firms in the state of Georgia. He had started with 2 associates, a rented office in Buckhead, and a reputation for taking cases that other firms considered too complicated or too unprofitable to bother with. Now, the firm occupied 4 floors of one of Midtown Atlanta's most prominent towers, employed 62 attorneys, and a support staff of over 200, and carried a client list that included corporations, municipalities, and individuals whose names appeared regularly in the kind of publications that tracked such things. Victor was 57 years old. He arrived at the office at 5:45 every morning, before the cleaning crew had finished, before the security shift changed, before the city outside his windows had fully committed to being awake. He had done this for so long that the building's overnight staff had stopped being surprised by the light already burning on the 32nd floor when they made their final rounds. This morning, he had arrived to find a message from the head of building security waiting on his desk. A routine flag from the overnight system. Conference room 7B. An item of interest on the 22nd floor footage. He had pulled it up himself, rather than waiting for someone to walk him through it. That was his way. He preferred to see things first, without commentary, without another person's interpretation, filtering what his eyes received. What he saw was a woman in a cleaning uniform, entering conference room 7B at 2:17 in the morning. She moved with the particular efficiency of someone who had performed the same task enough times that the body did it without being asked. She started at the windows. She worked left to right. Then she found the envelope. He watched her pick it up, set it down, open it. He watched her hands move through the contents with a steadiness that struck him as unusual. Most people confronted with that amount of money in an unexpected place showed it somewhere in their body. A pause that lasted too long, a shift in posture, the particular stillness of someone trying very hard not to react. This woman's hands moved the way hands move when they are doing something they have decided to do, not something that has surprised them into action. She read the contract. He could tell by the way her eyes tracked the pages, not scanning, not skimming, but reading with the focused attention of someone who understood the language in front of her. He sat with that for a moment. Then she took out her phone. He leaned forward slightly in his chair, the first movement he had made in several minutes. He watched her photograph the document. 3 pages. Precise. No hesitation once the decision was made. And then she put everything back. That was the part he had not expected. That was the part he watched twice. She replaced the contract. She restacked the bills with the same care she had used to remove them. She repositioned the envelope at the head of the table, as though she were returning something borrowed, rather than surrendering something found. She wrote a note. He could not read it from this angle, but he could see the deliberate motion of her hand and tucked it beneath the edge of the envelope. Then she finished cleaning the room. He picked up the desk phone and dialed the extension for Marcus Webb, the firm's head of security, a former investigator who had worked for Victor for 9 years, and who understood the difference between a question that required a report and a question that required discretion. "The woman on the 22nd floor footage from last night," Victor said when Webb answered. "I need a name, and I need you to keep this between us for now." Webb called back in 4 minutes. The name was Renee Caldwell. Night shift custodial staff contracted through a facilities management company the firm had used for 6 years, 3 years on site. Victor wrote the name on the legal pad in front of him. He looked at it for a moment. Then he asked Webb to run a quiet background, the kind that did not generate paperwork, and to have whatever he found on Victor's desk by end of business. After he hung up, he played the footage one more time. He stopped it at the moment She set the envelope back down. He let it sit there, frozen on the monitor. The woman in the cleaning uniform, the envelope at the head of the table, the note tucked carefully beneath its edge. On his desk, to the left of the monitor, sat a folder he had been reviewing the previous evening before he left for the night. Inside, it was a contract. 12 pages. A figure with more zeros than most people encountered in a lifetime. A signature line at the bottom, with his name printed beneath it in clean block letters. He had not signed it yet. He had told himself he needed one more night to think it over. That was what he told himself. He reached over and turned the monitor off. The office went quiet, in the way that rooms go quiet, when the last source of light and sound has been removed from them. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Atlanta was beginning to show its first gray suggestions of morning, the skyline emerging slowly from the dark, the way it did every day, indifferent to whatever had happened in the hours before. Victor sat in the half-dark and did not reach for his phone. He did not open the folder. He did not do any of the things that his next 12 hours would eventually require of him. He just sat there. He could not remember the last time he had done that. Sat in a room without an agenda, without a call to make or a document to review, without the forward momentum that had carried him from a rented office in Buckhead to the 32nd floor of a building with his name on the letterhead. He could not remember, and the not remembering felt like information. The apartment on Eddy Court had one window in the bedroom that faced east, and on summer mornings, the light came through it at an angle that landed directly on the floor beside the bed, a narrow rectangle of gold that moved slowly across the carpet as the morning progressed. Renee had never needed an alarm clock in this apartment. The light told her when it was 7, and her body had learned to listen. She opened her eyes and found Marcus already there. He was sitting in the gold rectangle, with his sketchbook in his lap, working with the focused quiet of a child who had been awake for some time and had found a way to fill it that did not require anyone else. He was 7 years old and small for it, the kind of small that made strangers underestimate him until they saw his eyes, which were his grandmother's eyes, sharp and patient and already tired of being underestimated. 2 years ago, a specialist at the Children's Clinic on Peachtree had explained to Renee that her son's auditory processing disorder meant the world reached him differently than it reached most people, sound arriving intact, but meaning dissolving somewhere between his ear and his understanding, like a signal interrupted by static that only he could hear. He had been drawing since he was 4. It was the language that never got scrambled. He finished a line and turned the sketchbook around so she could see it. NER, large, detailed the curves rendered with the careful attention of someone who had studied this subject. In the bottom right corner, he had written the number 18 in his deliberate block printing. He kept count of everything he drew more than once. The ear was up to 18. She looked at it for a long moment. He watched her look at it. Then he turned it back around and kept working satisfied. She got up. The kitchen was already occupied. Jade Renee's older daughter, 11 years old, and carrying herself like someone who had taken a quiet vote and decided that 11 was close enough to grown, had the stovetop going and 2 plates waiting on the counter. She had made eggs scrambled the way Marcus would eat them, which meant no visible pepper, and the edges cooked firm rather than soft. A preference she had identified through observation over the course of several months and now executed without being asked or thanked, because she did not do things in order to be thanked. She did things because they needed doing, and she was there. His appointment Thursday got moved to 4, Jade said, without turning around. I texted the clinic back and confirmed. Renee looked at her daughter's back, the careful set of her shoulders, the efficiency of her movements at the stove, and did not say the thing that rose in her chest every time she witnessed this. She said, "Thank you," instead, which was not the same thing, but was what she had. After the children left for school, Renee stood in the kitchen and listened to the building settle around her. The neighbors above had a toddler who ran laps between 7 and 8 every morning. The pipes in the wall behind the refrigerator knocked twice when the heat came on. These were the sounds of her mornings, as familiar and unremarkable as her own breathing. She opened the folder on the counter. The audiology clinic invoice was on top, as it had been for the past 3 days, because she had not yet found a way to file it that made it feel resolved. The total balance after insurance came to $412 for the month of June alone. The insurance explanation of benefits clipped behind it. Used language she had learned to parse with the same attention she had once applied to legal documents. The distinction between covered and allowable, between network rate and billed amount, between what they said they would pay and what they actually paid, which were reliably different numbers. She had a notebook where she tracked the gap. It was 11 pages long now. She had started it when Marcus was 5. She put the folder down. She poured the rest of the coffee into her mug and stood at the counter and drank it while looking at the window above the sink, which faced a brick wall 6 feet away. There was a pigeon on the ledge across from it. There was always a pigeon on the ledge across from it. She had named it Gerald approximately 4 months ago and immediately regretted the attachment, but Gerald was still there, so she picked up her phone. She had been carrying the weight of those 3 photographs since 2 in the morning. The way you carry something you have not yet decided what to do with, not in your hands, where you have to look at it, but somewhere in the body, in the shoulders or the chest, present without being examined. She opened the photo application and looked at them again in the morning light. The contract, the figures, the language that meant one thing to the people who wrote it, and something considerably worse to the people it was written about. Her thumb found the delete icon and rested there. The screen looked back at her. She put the phone face up on the counter and stepped away from it, the way you step away from something you do not fully trust yourself around. She rinsed her mug. She dried it. She set it on the rack. When she came back, there was a notification on the screen. A message from a number she did not recognize, sent while she was standing at the sink, pretending she was thinking about something else. She read it once standing up. Then she pulled out a chair and sat down and read it again. We need to talk about what you found. VH. Outside. Gerald shifted on the ledge and looked at nothing in particular. The pipes knocked once behind the refrigerator. The toddler upstairs had stopped running. Renee set the phone down on the table. She laced her fingers together on the surface in front of her the way she used to sit in depositions, and she thought about what it meant that someone with those initials already knew what she had found, and what it meant that he had reached out before she had decided what to do about it, and what it meant that in the 11 pages of her tracking notebook, and the $412, and the 18 drawings of an ear, not one single thing had prepared her for this particular morning. She did not delete the photos. She did not respond to the message. She just sat there, fingers laced, and waited for herself to figure out what came next. Marcus Webb delivered the background report at 11:47, slipping it onto Victor's desk with the quiet efficiency of a man who had learned that the person he worked for preferred information without ceremony. Webb had spent 14 years as an investigator before Victor hired him away from the firm that had employed him, and he was thorough in the way that people are thorough when they understand that incomplete information is more dangerous than no information at all. The report was 12 pages, single-spaced, tabbed. Victor read it in 23 minutes. Then he turned back to the first page and started again. The subject's full name was Renee Lorraine Caldwell, 31 years old, born and raised in Southwest Atlanta, the kind of neighborhood that appeared in policy papers about urban investment and disappeared from actual investment. Her academic record showed genuine aptitude, high marks through high school acceptance into a paralegal studies program at a mid-size institution in the metro area, completion of the program with distinction. She had passed her certification examination on the first attempt. Then the record changed. At 22, she had been present at a location where a search had been conducted. She had not been the target. The documentation was thin, in the way that documentation becomes thin when someone without resources encounters a system that moves quickly and explains itself slowly. The charges against her had ultimately been reduced and the record expunged or partially expunged, the kind of partial that shows up on background checks run by employers who know where to look, which was to say most employers who could afford the kind of legal talent that knew where to look. The prosecutor on this case was listed by name. Victor noted it. He read it twice. I knew that name. He set the page down and picked up the next one and continued reading because there was a discipline to getting through information before reacting to it. A discipline he had spent 30 years cultivating and which had served him in more difficult rooms than this one. 2 children, a daughter, 11, a son, 7, diagnosed with auditory processing disorder at age 5, currently enrolled in a clinic-based treatment program, 2 sessions per week, covered partially by an insurance plan that the report characterized as limited in its scope for specialized developmental services. The gap between what the treatment cost and what the insurance covered was documented in a number that Victor read and then read again. No applications for public assistance on file. No requests for emergency housing support. No enrollment in any of the supplemental benefit programs for which she would have qualified based on household income. Either she did not know they existed or she had decided not to use them. And looking at the rest of the file, Victor suspected it was the latter. I was on the final page when his office door opened. The man who entered was Derek Forsyth, the firm's head of internal legal affairs, a precise, careful attorney in his mid-40s, who had been with Haynes and Associates for 11 years, and who approached every situation professional and otherwise as though it were a deposition he needed to win. He was carrying a folder slim and neat, the kind that contained paperwork that had already been prepared. "I've reviewed the footage and the security report," Forsyth said, taking the chair across from Victor without being invited to sit. "Given that she photographed confidential documents, we have clear grounds to terminate the facility's contract and pursue civil action for the unauthorized capture of proprietary materials. I've drafted the initial paperwork." He set the folder on the edge of the desk. "I'd like to move on this today." Victor looked at the folder. He did not touch it. "Has anything been shared?" he asked. "Any portion of what she photographed, has it appeared anywhere?" Forsyth paused. "Not that we've identified." "Has she contacted anyone? Media, opposing counsel, anyone external to this building?" "Not that we've identified." "Then what specifically has she done?" Forsyth opened his mouth and closed it again, in the way of a man who has prepared thoroughly for an argument and has just realized that the other person is not going to have it on the expected terms. "She photographed confidential." "Drop it," Victor said. The room went quiet, in the particular way that rooms go quiet when someone with authority says something that the other person in the room did not anticipate and does not have an immediate response to. Victor, the liability exposure alone. "I heard you, Derek." Victor's voice did not change in volume or temperature. It was the same voice he used in courtrooms, in negotiations, in the conversations that mattered most. Level, unhurried, carrying the full weight of someone who had decided and was not interested in revisiting the decision. "Drop it. Close the file. If anything changes, if anything she photographed appears anywhere, through any channel, you will be the first person I call. Until then, this does not move forward." Forsyth looked at him for a moment. He picked up his folder. He stood. He left without saying anything further, pulling the door closed behind him with the careful precision of a man who was unhappy and had decided that showing it was not in his interest. Victor waited until the sound of Forsyth's footsteps had faded down the hall. Then he opened the bottom drawer of his desk and removed a manila folder that had lived there for the better part of 6 years, migrating from office to office as the firm had expanded and his own workspace had changed, always making the move, always ending up in the bottom drawer. He had opened it 3 times in 6 years. He had never done anything with what was inside. The label on the tab read the name of the prosecutor from Renee Caldwell's case. He opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a list of names, 17 in total, each one connected to the prosecutor through a different thread cases, payments, associations that had never been formally examined because no one with the resources to examine them had ever had sufficient reason to try. He began reading from the top. The first name he recognized, the second, the third. By the fourth, he had picked up a pen, not to write anything, but in the way that his hand reached for a pen when his mind was working through something it had not yet named. He read the fifth name, the sixth, the seventh, the eighth. Hein had not yet reached the ninth. The car had been parked on Eddy Court for 20 minutes before the light on the second floor came on. Victor had told his driver, a quiet man named Calvin, who had been with him for 4 years, and who understood that certain requests did not require explanation to cut the engine and the headlights when they pulled to the curb. Calvin had done so without comment, the way he did most things, and now sat with his hands folded in his lap and his eyes forward, a man with a particular talent for being present without being intrusive. The block was the kind that existed in every American city, not dangerous, not prosperous, occupying the honest middle ground of a neighborhood that had been promised things for a long time and had learned to manage without them. The buildings were older, the kind of older that comes with character, if you choose to see it that way, and with neglect if you do not. A corner store with a hand-lettered sign. 2 kids on bicycles, working the last light out of the evening. The smell of someone's dinner coming through a screen door. 2 buildings down, something with onions, something that took time. Victor sat in the back seat and looked up at the second floor of the building across the street. Through the window, he could see into a kitchen. The overhead light was on, warm and yellow, the kind that came from a bulb that had not been replaced with anything more modern, because the budget that governed such decisions had other priorities. At the kitchen table, he could make out 2 figures, a girl and a smaller boy. The girl, who he understood from the report to be 11 years old, had arranged a series of cards on the table between them. She picked one up, held it where the boy could see it clearly, and said something. The boy looked at the card. He looked at her mouth. She said it again slower, her lips forming the shape with exaggerated care. The kind of care that does not come from instruction, but from observation, from watching how the therapists did it, and deciding she could do it too at home on a weeknight with flashcards she had apparently made herself. The boy touched the card. He tried the word. She nodded once, the nod of someone keeping score internally, and moved to the next card. Victor watched this for longer than he had intended to. At some point, the light in the kitchen shifted. The overhead went off, and a lamp came on, the warmer, lower light of a household settling into its evening. The children disappeared from view, and for a while the window showed nothing but the lamp and the edge of a bookshelf and the corner of what appeared to be a refrigerator, with papers on it too far and too small to read. Then Renee appeared. She sat at the kitchen table with a folder open in front of her and a legal pad beside it, and she read with the same focused attention he had observed on the security footage, the careful tracking of someone who was not skimming, not reviewing, but studying. She made notes in the margin of whatever she was reading, the pencil moving in short, precise strokes. She turned a page. She went back to the previous page. She turned forward again. He knew from the report that she had completed her paralegal certification 8 years ago. Whatever was in that folder, she was keeping the knowledge current. She was maintaining a set of skills that the system had decided she was not allowed to use professionally, because a record that had been partially cleared was not the same thing as a record that did not exist, and the difference between those 2 things had cost her the career she had trained for. She was preparing for an opportunity that had not arrived yet. He did not know how long she had been doing that. The report had not said. Reports generally did not capture the things that happened at kitchen tables after children went to sleep. I had been watching for perhaps 40 minutes when she set the pencil down and stood up. She moved to the window, not opening it, just standing at it, looking down at the street below, with the expression of someone who has come to the window, not because there is anything particular to see, but because sometimes you need a moment with the outside world before you go back to whatever is on the table. Victor went very still. She was looking in the general direction of the car. He knew she could not see him. The street was dark. Calvin had cut the lights, and the car was an unremarkable sedan that blended into the unremarkable inventory of vehicles parked along an unremarkable block. She was not looking at him, but she stood there for a while in the window in the yellow light, and there was something in the quality of her stillness that made him feel irrationally that she was aware of being observed, even if she could not identify the source, the way certain people are, the way people who have spent years paying close attention to their surroundings develop a kind of peripheral awareness that functions almost like a sixth sense. After a time, she turned and went back to the table. His phone vibrated against the seat beside him. He looked at the screen. The message was from Forsyth. She photographed the contract. We have full grounds for termination and civil action. Waiting on your call. Victor read it. He set the phone face down on the seat. He looked back up at the second-floor window. The lamp was still on. The woman was back at the table, pencil in hand, folder open in front of her, doing the work that no one had asked her to do, and that no one was going to reward her for doing in a kitchen, on a block that the rest of the city had decided did not require its full attention. He did not pick up the phone. He did not call Forsyth. He just sat there in the dark car, on the dark street, and looked up at the light in the window, and he thought about the distance between that window and his office on the 32nd floor, and how many times he had traveled between those 2 points without once being aware that the distance existed. She had looked at the photographs 17 times since 2 in the morning. She knew the number because she had counted the same way she counted everything that mattered. The stacks of bills in the audiology invoice, the pages in the legal folders. She studied at the kitchen table the number of flashcards Jade had made for Marcus without being asked. Counting was the architecture her mind had built around uncertainty. When you could not control what was happening, you could at least control how precisely you understood it. The apartment was quiet, in the way it only got after 11. Marcus had been asleep since 8:30, the particular deep sleep of a child, whose days required more processing than most adults would ever know. Jade had gone to her room at 9 with a book, and had turned her light off sometime around 10. Renee had sat at the kitchen table with her legal folder until she could not read anymore, and then she had moved to the couch and sat in the dark with the television off, and the city doing its late-night business outside the window, and eventually she had picked up her phone. The 3 photographs were where she had left them. She opened the first one, the cover page of the contract, the one with the header and the party names and the date. She had studied this one the most. She knew its layout, the way she knew the layout of documents she had spent years learning to read, the way the important information was distributed across the page, and where the language that looked neutral was actually doing something else entirely. She pinched the screen and zoomed in on the lower right corner, where the edge of the manila envelope was visible in the frame. She had not been trying to photograph the envelope. She had been photographing the document. But the envelope had been there at the edge of the frame, and inside it she could see it now, at this magnification in a way she had not registered. The first 16 times she had looked, something was tucked against the interior wall of the envelope. Not a document, too small for a document. A photograph, a physical photograph, the kind printed on glossy paper, folded once. She adjusted the zoom. The image was blurry at this magnification, the pixels breaking apart into approximations of shape and color. But there were 2 figures visible. 2 men standing close, the body language of people who knew each other well enough to be comfortable in proximity. One of them had his back mostly to the camera. The other was facing slightly forward, his profile visible, his hand extended in what was clearly a handshake. She knew that profile. She had last seen it across a courtroom when she was 22 years old, on a day that had rearranged every plan she had made for her life up to that point. The man had stood at a podium and spoken with the practiced confidence of someone who knew exactly how the room was going to respond to what he said, and the room had responded accordingly. And what had followed had followed. 9 years. She had not seen his face in 9 years. But she had not forgotten it either, because there are some faces the mind keeps, whether you ask it to or not. She steadied her hand and zoomed in further, shifting the frame toward the second man, the one whose back was mostly turned. There was something at the edge of the frame that she had missed before something on the table behind them. She moved the image slowly, carefully, the way you move toward something you are not sure you want to reach. A business card, lying flat on the table, its printed face visible to the camera. The name on it was clear enough to read even through the pixel distortion. Victor Haynes, Haynes and Associates. She set the phone down on the cushion beside her. For a moment, she did not do anything. She sat with the information, the way you sit with something that has changed, the shape of a room without moving any of the furniture. Everything looks the same, and nothing is the same, and your body knows it before your mind has finished processing. Then she noticed her hands. They were trembling, not violently, not the kind of trembling that announces itself. The kind that starts in the fingers and works inward. The kind you only notice if you are paying attention, which she was because she was always paying attention. She pressed them flat against her thighs, and the trembling continued, indifferent to the instruction. She could not remember the last time her hands had done that. She had trained them out of it the way you train yourself, out of the responses that cost you the flinch, the hesitation, the visible evidence of being affected. She had spent years making her hands reliable. She looked up at the ceiling. The plaster had a crack running from the light fixture toward the window that the building manager had been going to fix for approximately 2 years. She had stopped mentioning it. The man whose business card was on that table was the man whose building she cleaned every night, whose conference rooms she wiped down, whose trash she emptied before the people who used those rooms arrived in the morning and filled them again with the ordinary business of their days. She moved through his building like weather present, functional, unnoticed. She had cleaned the room where that envelope was left. She had read what was inside it. She had made a decision about what to do with it. She had made that decision before she knew what she was now holding. She was a person who had spent 2 years learning to read the exact kind of document that had been in that envelope. She was a person who understood that information, once in your possession, carried weight, regardless of whether you had sought it. She was a person who had sat in enough legal contexts to know that there was no such thing as neutral when it came to evidence of wrongdoing. Silence was not the absence of a position. It was a position. She picked up the phone. She went to the message thread, the one with the 4 words and 2 initials that had been sitting unanswered since that morning. She looked at it for a moment. Then she typed 2 words and sent them before she could construct an argument against it. Name a time. She set the phone down on the cushion. Her hands were still trembling. She did not press them flat again. She let them. Some things you were allowed to feel. In your own apartment at 11 o'clock at night, when your children were asleep and the city was minding its own business outside. And there was no one watching who needed to see you hold it together. She let them tremble, and she sat in the dark, and she waited for the reply. 3 days was enough time to second-guess a decision 14 times and arrive back at the same place you started. Rennie had counted those 2. She had replied to his message the night she sent it, and his response had come back within 4 minutes a time and a date, nothing more. No explanation, no reassurance, no attempt to manage what she might be thinking in the hours between. Just coordinates the way you give coordinates to someone you expect to show up. She showed up. The building looked different in the afternoon. She had spent 3 years moving through it between midnight and 6, when the lobbies were empty and the marble floors reflected the overnight cleaning lights. Now it was 2 in the afternoon, and the lobby moved with the forward momentum of a working weekday people, with somewhere to be, elevator banks, cycling, the front desk, managing a queue. She walked through it, wearing the suit she had bought the year she finished her paralegal certification. Dark navy, well made for what she had paid. It fit differently now. The jacket looser across the shoulders, the waistband, with an inch of extra room that had not been there before. 3 years of the kind of tired that does not fully reverse itself will do that to a person. She wore it the way you wear the best thing you have, with the full commitment that makes the difference between wearing something and being dressed. The receptionist on 32 was expecting her. She was walked down a hallway she had mopped 270 times and shown into an office at the end of it. Floor-to-ceiling windows. Atlanta spread out below in every direction. The desk was mahogany, old, the kind of piece that had been in other offices before this one. Victor Haynes was standing when she entered. He waited until she had taken the chair across from his desk before sitting down himself. She noted it the way she noted everything, without expression, without assigning more meaning than the fact of it. She looked around once. Exit sight, lines, the arrangement of things that told you something about the person who had arranged them. Then she folded her hands in her lap and waited. He did not make her wait long. You photographed 3 pages of a confidential document, he said. I know that. My security team knows that. One other person in this firm knows that. And that conversation has been closed. He paused. Nothing you photographed has appeared anywhere outside this building. I verified that before I reached out. He set his hands on the desk. I'm not here to threaten you, Miss Caldwell. I'm not going to pursue any action against you. What I want to tell you is that I've read your file. Your actual file, not the background check. And there is a situation with your record that should not exist. And I have the means to help address it, if you're open to that conversation. He stopped and let it sit. She had thought through the likely versions of this meeting on the way over. The probable angles, the range of things a man in his position might want from a woman in hers. She had arrived with her responses organized, the way you organize a legal argument, primary position. Fallback, the question you ask when you want to know whether the person across from you is being honest or strategic. She reached into her bag and took out her phone. She opened the photograph, the first one, the cover page, and placed it on the desk between them, face up. She zoomed in slowly, moving through the image the way she had moved through it 17 times in her apartment, until the edge of the envelope came into frame, and then the small folded photograph tucked inside it, and then the two figures, and then the profile of the man she had last seen, standing at a podium when she was 22 years old, and her life was in the process of becoming something she had not planned for it to become. She looked up at Victor. That man placed restraints on my wrists when I was 22 years old, she said. He stood in front of a courtroom and made arguments he knew were not the complete truth, and the room accepted them. And what followed took 9 years from my life that I have not finished accounting for. She let that sit the way he had let his own words sit. Tell me why he is shaking your hand. Victor looked at the photograph for a long time. Not a glance, not the quick read of someone managing a situation. He looked at it the way you look at something, when you are doing the actual work of seeing his eyes moving across the image, with a steadiness that reminded her unexpectedly of Marcus studying one of his own drawings, looking for the thing that was not quite right yet. Then he placed both hands flat on the desk. It was not a defensive gesture. It was the gesture of someone who has made a decision and is making sure their body is aligned with it before the words come. Sit down, Ms. Caldwell, he said, though she was already seated, which meant it was not a direction about her posture. It was something else. An acknowledgement that what was coming required a different kind of readiness than the kind she had walked in with. There is something I need to tell you first, and it is going to be harder to hear than anything you have brought to this table. The afternoon light held steady through the windows. Atlanta went about its business 32 floors below. Neither of them moved. He reached into the drawer to his left and placed a folder on the desk between them. The tab was labeled with a name written in his handwriting, neat and deliberate, the kind of handwriting that belonged to someone who had spent decades producing documents that other people's lives depended on. 2 words, a first name and a last name. Reginald Moss. Renee looked at it. She had not thought about that name in 23 years. This was not an accident. It was a decision she had made when she was 8 years old, standing in the kitchen of the house on Avondale Drive, while her mother explained in the careful language that adults use when they are trying to protect children from the full weight of a true thing, that her father was not coming back. Renee had listened to the explanation. She had nodded at the appropriate moments, and then she had taken the name and placed it somewhere in the interior of herself, where she did not go, and she had not gone there since. She was very still. Victor opened the folder. He did not rush. He spoke the way she imagined he spoke, in the rooms where the most serious things got decided evenly, with the specific gravity of someone who understood that the words were going to land, and had made peace with that before he began. Reginald Moss, he explained, was the principal behind the contract she had found on the 22nd floor. Not a signatory, not a named party. The kind of presence in a document that existed in the negative space, in the structures that were built to make the money move, without leaving a clear trail back to the person who set it in motion. He had been operating this way for a long time, since at least 2009, which was as far back as Victor's documentation went, though he suspected the practice predated that by several years. The prosecutor, from her case, Victor continued, had been one of several arrangements Reginald Moss maintained over the years. Not every case, not a blanket arrangement, specific situations, specific outcomes, compensated in ways that did not appear in any filing that a standard search would surface. Victor had been building the file for 6 years, accumulating documentation through sources he did not name, waiting for a situation in which the documentation could be used without causing more harm than it prevented. I had not found that situation yet. He paused there, not for effect. The pause had the quality of someone who has arrived at the difficult part of a prepared statement and is giving the other person a moment before it arrives, which is its own kind of courtesy. Renee Caldwell, he said, is the name you took from your mother's side of the family. He said it as a statement, not a question. Your name at birth was different. The room held very still. Your birth name, Victor said, was Renee Moss. She did not move. She did not look away from the folder. She did not do any of the things that the body sometimes does when it receives information that reorganizes the architecture of a life. The exhale, the shift in posture, the hand that reaches for something to hold on to. She sat exactly as she had been sitting, hands in her lap, spine straight in the navy suit that was a size too large in the shoulders now. 4 minutes passed. Victor did not fill them. He had been in enough of rooms where silence was doing necessary work to know that interrupting it was the wrong instinct, regardless of how uncomfortable the quiet became. He waited. He looked at his hands. He waited some more. When she spoke, her voice was level, not controlled in the effortful way of someone suppressing something. Level in the way that certain materials are level, because that was their nature, because they had been formed under enough pressure to become that way permanently. He left when I was 8, she said. I have not said his name since. She stood up. She moved to the window, the same window she had looked up at from the street when she was pushing her cleaning cart through the lobby. At 2 in the morning, the same glass that separated the 32nd floor from the Atlanta sky. Up close, the city looked different than it did from a distance. Smaller, more particular, less like a backdrop, and more like a collection of specific places where specific people were doing specific things that had nothing to do with what was happening in this room. The money I put back, she said. She was still looking out the window. That was his money. It was not a question. It was the sound of a person placing a fact into its correct position, in a sequence, the way you place the final piece of an accounting entry that has been off by one line for longer than you realized. She turned from the window. She looked at Victor directly, the way she had looked at him when she placed the phone on the desk, without performance, without protection, with the full attention of someone who needed the answer to mean something. Did he know it was me who found it? Victor had answered her question. She had not stayed long after that. She did not remember pressing the button for the lobby, or walking through the revolving door, or crossing the plaza in front of the building where she had spent 3 years, arriving before dawn and leaving before the city woke up. She became aware of herself again somewhere on Peachtree Street, heading south, the afternoon sun hitting the left side of her face, her bag over one shoulder, and her good shoes making the specific sound of leather soles on concrete that she associated with a version of her life she had not inhabited in a long time. She did not call for a car. Her father had taught her to walk when she was small, not in the way that all parents teach children to walk, the early, lurching steps across a living room floor, but to walk as a practice, as a way of moving through problems. He had taken her with him on Sunday mornings through the neighborhood. No destination, just movement. And he had explained that your feet knew things your head was still working on, and that the best thing you could do with a complicated situation was put your body in motion and let the two of them sort it out together. It was the only useful thing he had left her with before he disappeared from her life entirely. She walked. Midtown gave way to the blocks below it, in the way that Atlanta neighborhoods shift. Not all at once, but gradually, the buildings changing scale and age, the storefronts adjusting their inventory to reflect the income level of the people most likely to walk through their doors. She passed a dry cleaner, a nail salon, a church with a handwritten sign in the window advertising a food pantry on Saturdays. She passed a school with a fence around the playground, empty at this hour, the swings moving slightly in the late afternoon heat. She thought about what she was holding, not the photographs, specifically, the situation they represented. She was a person in possession of documentation that connected a man with significant resources to a pattern of arrangements that had harmed people who could not afford to protect themselves from being harmed. She was also that man's daughter, which she had not been this morning when she woke up. Or rather, she had been, but had not known it, which was a distinction that felt important, even if she could not yet articulate why. She thought about what she could do with it. She could find the kind of people who made careers out of stories, exactly like this one. The reporters who specialized in the space where money and the legal system produced outcomes that the system was not designed to advertise. She had known in her paralegal years where those people published and what they needed to make a story move. A photograph, a contract, a name. She could use what she held as direct leverage, a private communication, a specific demand, the kind of arrangement that people with documentation sometimes made with the people that documentation concerned. She had enough legal training to understand the precise line between that and something that crossed into territory she did not want to occupy. She could do nothing. She could delete the photographs, close the folder in her mind, the way she had closed the one on Avondale Drive at age 8, and continue showing up to the building on the night shift until she had enough saved to move somewhere the waiting lists were shorter. She thought about Marcus. She thought about Jade, who had made flashcards from index cards and learned a therapy technique by watching videos on a shared tablet and implemented it at the kitchen table without telling anyone she was doing it, because Jade understood that the resources available to their family were finite and had decided not to require more of them than necessary. She thought about her mother, who had raised 2 children in a house where the name Reginald Moss was not spoken, not because she was bitter, she was not a bitter woman, but because she had made a practical determination that energy spent on absence was energy taken from presence, and she had chosen presence every time. Her mother had worked 2 jobs for 11 years. She had never once suggested that what happened to her was someone else's fault to fix. Renee stopped. She was in front of the small grocery, the kind of store that existed in every neighborhood that the larger chains had decided were not worth the square footage. Family owned, the windows full of hand-lettered signs for things sold by the pound. The glass in the door was old enough to have a slight warp to it, and in that warp, her reflection looked back at her, slightly distorted the navy suit, and the straight spine, and the face she had been keeping neutral for the past 47 minutes. She looked at herself for a long moment. She knew what she had. She understood its value in every sense of the word, legal, financial, personal. She had spent enough years in rooms where information was currency to know exactly what this particular currency could buy. She also knew with the same certainty that buying it was not something she was going to do. Not because she was afraid of the consequences. Not because she lacked the knowledge to navigate them. Because the person looking back at her from the warped glass in the door of a corner grocery on a Wednesday afternoon in Atlanta was not a person who used what she knew to take what she wanted. She had been raised by a woman who had every reason to become that person and had declined specifically and deliberately every single day. She pushed the door open and went inside. She found what she needed in the stationery section, a small display near the register, the kind of impulse buy placement that stores used for items people forgot they needed until they were standing in front of them. A pack of white envelopes, letter size 10 to APAC. She paid in cash. She put the pack in her bag. She went back out into the afternoon. She walked the rest of the way home with her hand resting on the outside of her bag, feeling the slight rectangular weight of what was inside it, thinking about what she was going to put in it when she got there. The envelope arrived in the morning's first delivery, sorted into the stack that his assistant left on the corner of his desk before 7. It was unremarkable in every visible way. Standard letter, size, white. A first-class stamp in the upper right corner, his name and the firm's address, printed in the careful block lettering of someone who had learned to write precisely and had not unlearned it. No return address, no identifying marks. Victor had received tens of thousands of pieces of correspondence over the course of 30 years. Briefs, contracts, settlement offers, threats dressed up as legal notices, the occasional handwritten letter from a client who felt that the gravity of their situation required something more personal than an email. He had developed through sheer volume a reliable sense of what an envelope contained before he opened it, a sense built from weight and size, and the particular quality of deliberateness that some pieces of mail carried and others did not. This one had it. He opened it carefully, the way he opened things he intended to keep. Inside was a single sheet of paper folded once. On it, printed from a phone or a home printer on standard copy paper, were 3 photographs, the same images from the security footage he had reviewed 6 days ago, now reproduced in the flat, slightly washed-out quality of a consumer printer doing its best. Clipped to the sheet with a single paper clip was a smaller piece of paper, torn from something the edge was uneven, the kind of tear that came from a notepad or the margin of a larger page. 7 words written by hand. "Do what is right. I already did mine." He read it once. He read it again. He set it on the desk and read it a 3rd time. And on the 3rd reading, he stopped looking at it as a message directed at him and started looking at it as a statement about her, about the person who had written it, who had walked into his office in a suit that no longer fit quite right and placed a phone on his desk and asked a question that deserved an honest answer, and who had then gone home and made a decision about what to do with everything she was holding. She had not used it. She had sent it to him instead, with 7 words that were not a request and not a demand and not a negotiation. They were a statement of position, a declaration. The way certain legal filings were declarations. This is where I stand. This is what I have done. The rest belongs to you. He looked out the window. Atlanta was fully awake at this hour. The morning traffic moving through the arteries below with the particular density of a city that had been growing faster than its infrastructure for the better part of 2 decades. He had watched this view for 11 years from this office, and a version of it for years before that, from other offices in other buildings, and it had long since stopped being something he saw and become something that was simply there, the way familiar things become invisible through repetition. How was seeing it this morning? He opened the bottom drawer of his desk. The folder had been there for 6 years, transferred from drawer to drawer, through 3 office moves, always finding its way to the same position. Bottom drawer, left side, beneath the hanging files. The tab read the prosecutor's name in handwriting that was his own, but looked older than he felt the writing of a man who had believed 6 years ago that he would find the right moment to use what was inside, and had been waiting ever since, for a moment that never clarified itself into action. The moment, it turned out, had not been his to identify. He picked up his desk phone. Not his cell, the desk phone, the one with the direct line that bypassed the switchboard, and the assistant, and the layers of professional intermediary that governed most of his communications. He dialed from memory. The number for the Georgia Attorney General's office was not a number he had ever expected to call from this desk, for reasons that had everything to do with the nature of what his firm did and the relationships that work required. He called it anyway. When the line connected, he said his name and asked for the division that handled matters involving prosecutorial conduct. He was placed on hold. He waited, which was something he had been doing more of lately, and was becoming, if not comfortable, with at least less resistant to. The call was answered. He said, "My name is Victor Haynes. I have documentation regarding a pattern of conduct in Fulton County going back to 2009. I am prepared to provide full cooperation." He did not look at the 7 words while he said it. He did not need to. They had already done what they came to do. Across the city, in the kitchen of an apartment on Eddy Court, Renee was standing at the stove with a spatula in her hand when Marcus climbed into his chair at the table. She had her back to him. She heard the chair scrape against the linoleum, heard the small settling sounds of a 7-year-old arranging himself in a seat, and then she heard something else. A sound. Not a word. Not quite the shape of one, the attempt at one. His mouth working through the architecture of something his brain was trying to deliver to the air between them. She turned around. Howe was looking directly at her. His hands, flat on the table, on either side of the placement. his expression carrying the specific concentration of someone doing something that required everything they had. She set the spatula down. She did not speak. She did not smile in the encouraging way that could sometimes feel like pressure, like a performance of confidence that made the stakes feel higher rather than lower. She just looked at him the way she had always looked at him, the way that said she was there, and she was staying, and whatever came next had all the time it needed. He tried again. The sound that came out was closer, not a complete word, the beginning of one, the first sound of something that was on its way. It landed in the kitchen between them, like something fragile set down carefully on a surface that would hold it. She waited. 48 hours was not a long time in the life of a legal proceeding. It was, however, long enough for a building to change its atmosphere without changing anything visible about itself. The tower on Peachtree still looked the same from the outside. Same glass, same steel, same lobby, with the same marble floor that caught the morning light at the same angle it always had. The overnight cleaning crew still came and went on schedule. The elevator banks still cycled. The coffee on the 32nd floor was still made by the same machine at the same strength at the same time every morning. But 48 hours after Victor Haynes placed a call to the Georgia Attorney General's office, the air inside the building had the quality that air acquires when people who are paid to anticipate problems have begun to sense one approaching and have not yet been told how large it is. The Attorney General's office had moved quickly, which was either a sign that the documentation Victor had provided was as substantial as he believed it to be, or a sign that the name attached to it had enough weight to accelerate a process that normally moved at the pace of institutional caution, possibly both. Victor had been in enough rooms where legal and political considerations operated simultaneously to understand that the two were rarely as separate as either side preferred to claim. By the second morning, a pair of investigators had made contact with the firm's general counsel, a courtesy notification framed carefully that certain records related to specific matters might be requested in the coming weeks. The general counsel had brought this information to the managing partners before 9 in the morning, and by 10:30, the conference room on the 31st floor was occupied by 6 people who had not scheduled a meeting. Victor was one of them. He had arrived last, which was not his habit, and sat at the end of the table rather than the head, which was. The meeting had the texture of conversations that take place when everyone in the room already knows the essential facts and is working out in real time what those facts mean for their particular interests. There were questions about exposure, about client relationships, about the firm's standing with the institutions it worked alongside every day. These were reasonable questions. Victor answered the ones directed at him and did not volunteer information that had not been asked for, which was a discipline he had learned early and had never had more occasion to apply than in the last 48 hours. I had expected most of it. I had not entirely anticipated Richard Okafor. Okafor was the firm's senior litigation partner, 22 years at Haynes & Associates, the kind of tenure that produced both deep institutional loyalty and a particular sensitivity to anything that threatened the institution. He was meticulous, effective, and had built a career on the understanding that the firm's relationships with the legal and financial community of Atlanta were assets as carefully managed as any client portfolio. He waited until the other partners had left the conference room before he spoke. He closed the door first. $30 million, Okafor said, without preamble, which was his way. That is a conservative estimate of what we stand to lose in client relationships alone, before we account for the reputational adjustment in new business. I have run these numbers twice. He set a single sheet of paper on the table between them, turned so Victor could read it. You are throwing away $30 million. For what? Victor looked at the number on the page. It was accurate. He had run similar numbers himself at 2 in the morning, 3 nights ago, in the quiet of an office where the only light came from a desk lamp and the glow of a screen. For the answer to a question I should have asked 30 years ago, he said. Okafor looked at him for a moment. Not with anger. Richard Okafor was too precise a man for anger to be his primary register. With the expression of someone processing a response that did not fit the framework of the conversation he had prepared for. He picked up the sheet of paper. He left without saying anything further, which was its own kind of answer. The answer of a man who understood that the decision had already been made, and that his role now was to manage what came next. Victor sat alone in the conference room. Through the windows, Atlanta conducted its afternoon business with complete indifference to what had just happened on the 31st floor. 40 miles south of the city, in a county courthouse, a process server had delivered a document to the registered address of a holding company whose ultimate beneficial owner was a man named Reginald Moss. The document had been signed for by an assistant who had then placed a call that set off a sequence of subsequent calls that would over the next several weeks involve attorneys and accountants and advisors of various kinds, all of them working to understand exactly how much of what had been carefully constructed over 15 years was now in the process of becoming visible. Victor did not know the specifics of that sequence. He knew its general shape because he had spent 30 years watching similar shapes unfold from both sides of the courtroom. His phone vibrated on the table in front of him. He looked at the screen. A message from a number he did not recognize. Not a firm contact, not a saved entry. A number he had never seen before. He opened it and read it. He read it a second time, more slowly, his eyes moving through the words with the attention of someone checking their own comprehension. He set the phone down. He picked it up again. He stood up from the conference table, walked to the door, opened it, and spoke to the first person he saw in the hallway, his assistant, who was carrying a folder and had the expression of someone with 4 things to tell him simultaneously. "Get the car," Victor said. "Now." His assistant opened her mouth. "Now?" he said again, already moving toward the elevator. She was on the 14th floor when her phone vibrated against her hip. The 14th floor was storage and records, low traffic, low light. The kind of floor that accumulated the paperwork of 30 years of litigation in metal shelving units that ran from one end of the space to the other. She cleaned it on Tuesdays and Thursdays, working through the rows with a dry mop that picked up the particular fine dust that settled on surfaces when air circulated through paper for years at a time. It was quiet work in a quiet space, and she had come to appreciate it the way she appreciated most things that asked nothing of her except attention and consistency. She looked at the screen. Unknown number, local area code. She let it go to voicemail. The cleaning industry had its share of people who called from numbers that were not worth answering, scheduling coordinators from the facilities company, vendors, the occasional wrong number that landed on her line with the confidence of someone who was certain they had dialed correctly. She had learned to let unknowns go and check messages because the things that were actually urgent found a way to make themselves known through channels that identified themselves. The phone vibrated again. Same number. Immediately, people who called back that fast either had something important to say or were very bad at reading social signals. She had learned over the years that the former was more common than the latter. She answered. "Ms. Caldwell." The voice was Victor's. She recognized it the way you recognize the voice of someone you have had one significant conversation with, which imprints differently than the voice of someone familiar. "I need to tell you something, and I need to tell you quickly. Are you somewhere you can talk?" She looked down the empty row of shelving. Fluorescent light, metal shelves, the distant sound of the building's ventilation system doing its work. "Yes," she said. I told her. The message that had come in on the conference room table had been sent from a number registered to a communications firm that handled, among other things, private correspondence for clients who preferred not to use their own contact information. The content of the message had identified with a specificity that suggested either surveillance or a well-placed source that the person who had found and reported the envelope on the 22nd floor was a member of the overnight cleaning staff. It had asked in language that was careful enough to be technically ambiguous what that person's current situation was, and whether it was the kind of situation that might benefit from attention. Victor had not responded to the message. He had instead gotten in his car and driven to the building to find the head of facilities management, a conversation that had confirmed what he needed to confirm, which was that no one from the facilities side had communicated anything about Renee to anyone outside the building. The source of the information was therefore somewhere else, and the somewhere else had a limited number of possibilities. He knows someone found it, Victor said. He does not appear to know your name. Not yet, but the question has been asked, which means someone is looking for the answer. Renee stood very still between the shelving units. Does he know I am his daughter? She asked. A pause, brief but real. I do not know, Victor said. I have no indication that he does, but I cannot tell you with certainty that he does not. She processed that for a moment, the way she processed information that had multiple implications, sorting through them in the order of their relevance, identifying the ones that required immediate attention, and setting aside the ones that could wait. Then he does not know why I put it back, she said. The line was quiet for a moment. No, Victor said, he does not. She thought about what that meant. A man who had spent 15 years building structures designed to protect himself from consequences was now asking questions about the person who had touched his money and returned it without taking anything. He was trying to understand a variable that did not fit the model he had built his operations around. Because in his model, people who found $80,000 in an envelope did not put it back. That was not a data point his system had a column for. He did not know why she had done it, because he did not know who she was. Not really. Not in the way that would make the answer obvious. Thank you for telling me, she said. Renee. It was the first time he had used her first name. She noticed it the way she noticed small things without reaction, but completely. Be careful. She ended the call. She stood in the row of shelving, with the phone in one hand and the dry mop handle in the other, in the quiet of the 14th floor, in the building she had cleaned for 3 years, which was also the building where her father's money had sat in an envelope at the head of a conference table while she counted it and put it back. She opened the photo application. The 3 images were where they had always been, the same photographs she had looked at 17 times in her apartment, that she had printed and sent in a white envelope with 7 words that had already done the work they needed to do. She looked at them one more time, not studying them, not reading the contract language, or analyzing the composition of the image. Just looking the way you look at something before you release it, acknowledging what it was, what it had meant, what it had cost to hold, and what it would cost to keep holding. She pressed delete. The confirmation prompt appeared. She confirmed it. The images were gone. She stood with the phone in her hand for a moment after, in the particular silence that follows a decision that cannot be undone. She was not second-guessing it. She was not mourning it. She was simply noting it the way she noted all significant things. Precisely. Without embellishment, and then moving on. Keeping those photographs would have changed what they were. They had been evidence of a choice she had made. If she held on to them now, after everything she knew, they would become something else. A reserve, a contingency, the kind of thing you kept because you were not entirely sure you were done needing it. She had seen what people became when they organized their lives around things they were not done needing. She had decided at some point that she could not precisely identify that she was not going to be that. She put the phone in her pocket. She picked up the mop. She finished the row. The kitchen light was on when Renee pushed open the front door at 2:53 in the morning. Jade was at the kitchen table, still dressed. In front of her, a piece of paper folded once set precisely in the center of the placemat, the way she set things when she wanted them to be seen, but not immediately claimed. Renee closed the door, set her bag down, lined up her shoes by the door, walked to the kitchen in her socks, and sat down across from her daughter. Jade looked at her with the full, unhurried attention of someone who had spent years learning to read a specific person and had become very good at it. She was 11 years old, and she saw things. Renee had long since stopped being surprised by this. What happened? Jade said. Not accusing, not anxious. The question of someone who had already determined that something had happened and was ready to receive the information. Renee looked at her daughter for a moment. She had kept the contents of the last 10 days inside her own mind, sorted and managed, and not shared with anyone under this roof. Because the first principle of the way she had always operated was that her children were not the place where her problems went. But Jade was 11, not 6. And she was sitting at the kitchen table at 3 in the morning with a folded piece of paper and the expression of someone who had already decided to stay up until she got an answer. Renee told her, not everything, not the name on the folder or the details that belonged to other people, or the parts of the investigation that were still unresolved, but enough. The envelope, the decision, the photograph inside the photograph, the meeting, what she had learned and what she had chosen to do with it and why she had chosen it. Jade listened without interrupting once. This was not a performance of patience. It was the real thing, the kind that came from a child who had learned early that the most important information lived in the parts of a conversation that people skipped when they were not being careful. She sat with her hands in her lap and her eyes on her mother's face, and the apartment held the quiet of a place where everyone was either asleep or paying complete attention. From the hallway came the slow, even rhythm of Marcus breathing in his sleep. The sound Renee had calibrated herself to over 7 years. The sound that meant everything was okay in the room where it mattered most. When Renee finished, Jade reached across the table and picked up the folded piece of paper. She held it for a moment, not looking at Renee. Then she unfolded it and set it on the table between them, turned so Renee could see it right side up. 2 figures drawn in pencil, not detailed. Jade had never been a visual artist the way Marcus was, but the 2 figures were clearly 2 people standing close, without touching the smaller one's shoulder, just at the level of the taller one's arm. Below them in Jade's even deliberate handwriting, "Mom always puts things back where they belong." Renee looked at it. She did not trust herself to speak for a moment. She picked up the drawing and held it the way you hold something that has arrived at exactly the right moment carefully, as though the moment itself were fragile. Her phone vibrated on the table. A message from Victor, sent 11 minutes ago while she was still on the bus home. The firm was creating a formal paralegal position, a role that had been informally needed and never properly structured, attached to the division that handled the cases he had spent his career believing in. Full benefits. A partnership with a local law school offered an evening program fully funded for qualifying candidates. The position started the following Monday if she wanted it. She read it twice. She set the phone down. She picked up Jade's drawing and folded it once. Along the crease, Jade had already made the fold that meant it was designed to be carried rather than displayed. She opened her wallet. The slot where the photographs had lived for 10 days, the 3 images she had deleted 4 hours ago in a storage room on the 14th floor, was empty. Now, the leather still holding the faint impression of what had been there. She put the drawing in. It fit the way things fit, when they were always meant to go there. She picked up her phone, opened Victor's message, typed 2 words, and sent them before the part of her brain that cataloged risks could organize a response. "I accept." She set the phone face down on the table. Jade had been watching her the whole time, in the way that Jade watched things completely, without performance. She did not ask what the message said. She did not ask what had been decided. She looked at her mother's face and read what was there, and whatever she found was sufficient, because she pushed her chair back, came around the table, and put her arms around Renee's shoulders from behind. Brief. The embrace of someone who understood that a moment did not require duration to mean something. Then she went to her room. Renee sat alone in this kitchen. The light above the stove hummed its low, familiar hum. Marcus breathed in the hallway. Outside, the city kept going, because cities do not stop for the moments that change things. She did not need it to. There are exactly 9 steps between a decision and the morning it becomes real. Renee counted them, without meaning, to somewhere between Saturday afternoon and Sunday night, when the apartment held a particular kind of quiet that comes not from emptiness, but from anticipation. She ironed the navy suit again. Not because it needed it. She had ironed it the week before the day she walked into Victor's office, but because the act of doing it felt like preparation she could control. The collar, the left sleeve, the seam along the back that had started to thin at the shoulder. She pressed it anyway and hung it on the doorframe the way her mother used to hang things worth protecting. On Saturday evening, she sat with Jade at the kitchen table and explained the new schedule: earlier wake-up, a different bus route, 2 nights per week when dinner would need to be started before Renee got home. Jade listened with a pen in her hand, writing nothing down, which meant she was memorizing. Renee recognized the habit. She had done the same thing at 11, sitting across from her own mother, learning how the world required constant adjustment. With Marcus, she kept it simple. She told him Monday would be different, that she would be working in a new place, doing new work, but she would still be home for dinner most nights. He looked at her for a moment, then went back to the drawing he had been working on, a pair of hands open facing upward. She did not ask what it meant. Some things did not need translation. Monday came the way important mornings always do, quietly, without ceremony. She arrived at 8:45. The lobby of the Haynes and Associates building was already in motion, attorneys with coffee cups, assistants with folders, the low hum of a building that had been running long before she walked through its front door. She had entered this building hundreds of times. Through the service entrance on the south side, with a badge clipped to her uniform, in the hours when most of the lights were off. This was different. She walked through the main entrance. She signed in at the front desk with her name. She rode the elevator to the 24th floor, not the 22nd, where she had cleaned for 3 years, but 2 floors above it, where the paralegal offices sat along a corridor with windows that looked east over the city. Her desk was the 4th from the left. A desktop computer, a legal pad, a pen, a stack of procedural manuals someone had left in a neat pile. No note, no welcome card, just the materials and the expectation that she would know what to do with them. She sat down. She opened the computer. She spent the first 2 hours reading the firm's case management system without asking anyone to explain it. By the afternoon, she had mapped the filing structure well enough to navigate without a guide. She made no errors she was aware of. She asked no questions she could answer herself. The first full team meeting happened on Wednesday. 11 people in a conference room, 1 floor below Victor's office. She sat at the far end of the table. She did not speak unless addressed. She took notes in the margins of the agenda, small observations about process, about the order in which information moved through the room. Old habits, the kind that had kept her sharp in the years when sharpness was the only thing she had to offer. By the second week, Marcus had started his first full round of audiology treatment. 3 sessions scheduled. The clinic on Ashby Street, covered now under the firm's benefits plan. Jade had begun her final year of high school with a schedule that left her 3 free periods in the afternoon time. She had already filled Renee noticed with a college prep workbook she had borrowed from the library without mentioning it. The case file came on a Thursday. Victor placed it on her desk without commentary. A name on the tab, a case number, a flag marked priority. She opened it after he left and read the first 4 pages before she understood what she was looking at. A 23-year-old woman. A misdemeanor charge from 2 years prior, already resolved. A background screening error that had flagged the charge incorrectly, listed as a felony in the automated system, costing her a housing application, and 3 months later, a job offer. The woman had filed a complaint. The complaint had gone unaddressed. Now it had become a formal case. Renee read the pages again, not for comprehension. She had understood on the first pass. She read them again, because she needed a moment with what she was holding. She closed the file. She placed it flat on the desk. She would open it again tomorrow, not because she lacked the ability, but because she owed the work, the kind of attention that one night of sitting with something quietly can sometimes produce. Outside the window, Atlanta moved at its usual pace. The city did not know what had changed. It rarely did. That was never the point. Time felt different now. Not faster, not easier, just oriented, the way a compass needle settles after you hold it still long enough. She picked up her bag. She took the file with her. 8 months is long enough for a city to change its weather twice, and for a child to learn something no one expected him to learn on anyone else's schedule. The waiting room outside the therapy suite on Ashby Street had 12 chairs and 1 window that faced a parking structure. Renee had sat in that room enough times to know which chair had the loose armrest, which ceiling tile had a faint water stain shaped like an open palm, and exactly how long the fluorescent light above the door took to stop flickering after it was switched on. 3 seconds. She had counted it more than once. Today, she was not in the waiting room. She was in the observation corridor, a narrow hallway behind a pane of one-way glass that parents were occasionally invited to use. When a session reached a milestone, the therapist believed was worth witnessing in real time. Dr. Yvonne Marsh, Marcus's primary speech and language therapist for the past 7 months, had sent a message the evening before. Brief, direct. Come to the Thursday session if you can. Bring Jade if she's available. Renee had not told Marcus she would be there. Jade stood beside her, one shoulder against the wall, arms crossed loosely. Not in resistance, just in the particular stillness she adopted when she was paying close attention to something she did not want to interrupt with movement. Inside the room, Marcus sat across a small table from Dr. Marsh. He was 8 now. He had his grandmother's jawline, though Renee had never told him that. He had a drawing pad at the edge of the table, a habit Dr. Marsh had incorporated into sessions early on, understanding that Marcus processed language more fluidly when his hands had something to do. The pad was open to a blank page. Dr. Marsh leaned forward slightly and asked him in the calm and unhurried voice that Renee had come to recognize as the therapist's most precise professional tool what he wanted for dinner that evening. It was a question without stakes. That was the point. Marcus looked up from the blank page. He did not look at Dr. Marsh. He turned his head toward the glass, not because he knew anyone was behind it, but because the east-facing window sat just beside it, and the afternoon light came from that direction. He looked toward the light the way he always did when he was gathering something from somewhere interior and preparing to offer it outward. And then he said it. A full sentence. Subject, verb, object. Unprompted by a visual card, unassisted by the ear-level device he had worn to every session for the first 4 months. His voice was quiet and slightly uneven at the edges, the way any voice sounds when it is carrying something heavier than its usual load. But every word was present. Every word was clear. Renee placed her hand over her mouth. She did not realize she had done it until she felt the warmth of her own breath against her palm. Jade said nothing. She reached over and took her mother's other hand and held it with both of hers, the way adults hold something they are afraid might otherwise fall. They stood like that for a moment that did not fit inside any unit of time Renee knew how to measure. On the walk to the parking lot, Renee took out her phone. She typed one line to Victor. He spoke today. She sent it before she had finished deciding whether to send it. The reply came in less than 4 minutes, I know. I heard. She read it twice. She did not respond. She did not need to. That evening, she stood in front of the refrigerator, the way people stand in front of things that have been holding something for them without being asked. The door was layered, the drawing of an ear that Marcus had completed before she knew any of this would happen, a therapy schedule from 3 months ago that no longer applied, but that she had not removed 2 lines of case notes in her own handwriting from a late evening she barely remembered, and Jade's drawing of 2 figures standing side by side, 7 words in a child's careful print running along the bottom edge. All of it still there. She opened the refrigerator, took out a glass bottle of water, closed the door. She stood looking at the drawing of the ear. She was not thinking about the case file on her desk. She was not thinking about the months it had taken, the appointments, the insurance forms, the 3 phone calls with the clinic's billing department. She was not even thinking about the sentence itself. The words Marcus had chosen the object of the verb, the particular thing he had said he wanted. She was only thinking about his voice, the way it had moved through the glass, the way it had reached her anyway. There are buildings that hold memory in their stone. The Fulton County Courthouse on Pryor Street is one of them. Wide steps columns that do not apologize for their height, a lobby that smells faintly of old paper, and central air conditioning, running at a temperature calibrated for no one in particular. The kind of building that has seen enough human difficulty that it no longer registers surprise at any of it. Renee had been inside it once before. She did not need to calculate how long ago. The body keeps that kind of arithmetic without being asked. She arrived at 7:45 in the morning, 90 minutes before the scheduled hearing. She had learned early that preparation is not something that happens the night before. It is something that continues until the moment the door opens and becomes irreversible. She spread the case materials across the table in the small prep room assigned to their side. The original complaint, the corrected background screening report, the 2 supporting affidavits, the timeline she had reconstructed across 11 pages of her own legal pad, over the course of 4 months. The woman whose case this was sat across from her, 23 years old. A job offer rescinded a housing application, denied a 2-year-old misdemeanor listed incorrectly in an automated system as something it had never been. She had filed her complaint quietly and waited. She had not stopped waiting until someone at Haynes and Associates pulled her file and sent it to a paralegal on the 24th floor. Renee did not tell her any of that. She went through the documents instead, line by line, the way she had learned to do not performing competence, but exercising it. The hearing lasted 40 minutes. Victor was in the back row when Renee came out of the chamber. She did not see him until she was already in the hallway. Folder under her arm, the particular stillness of a room, just after something has been resolved, still settling around her. He was in a dark suit, no tie, sitting with the posture of a man who had arrived early and planned to leave without announcement. He stood when she approached. Neither of them said anything immediately. The hallway had the quality of a held breath, lawyers moving past a clerk with a cart of files, the distant sound of an elevator, arriving and departing. In the middle of all that motion, the two of them stood in a corridor and did not fill the silence with anything unnecessary. Then Victor said, "Eleanor would have liked you." He did not explain who Eleanor was. He did not need to. Renee had seen the photograph on the corner of his desk, a woman with close-cut hair and a particular kind of smile that suggests the person wearing it has decided at some point to find most things worth being present for. She had never asked. Some things in an office communicate themselves without requiring a question. Renee said, "Tell me about her sometime." Victor looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded a single, deliberate movement, the kind that signals not just agreement, but something older than agreement. It was the first time he had offered that nod to anyone on the subject of Eleanor. Renee understood that without needing it confirmed. She walked out through the lobby and pushed open the heavy door, and the Atlanta morning came at her all at once. Heat already building at 10 in the morning, the particular quality of light that the city holds in the hours before midday, when everything looks slightly more possible than it did the evening before. She stopped on the third step from the bottom. Her phone moved in her jacket pocket. She took it out. A message from Jade sent 7 minutes ago, brief in the way Jade's messages always were, when the thing being communicated did not require elaboration. Marcus read his own name off a piece of paper this morning. "Just wanted you to know." Renee read it once. She did not move for a moment. She was standing on the steps of a building she had last entered in handcuffs, with no one in the gallery, no one she could call, no clear sense of what the next year would look like, or whether she would come out of it with anything intact. That had been the geography of her life at 22. And this, the folder under her arm, the morning light, the message on her phone, the nod from a man who had not spoken of his wife to anyone in longer than either of them had said aloud. This was the geography of it now. The distance between those two places was not small. She had walked every inch of it. For the first time, in longer than she could accurately remember, that distance did not feel like something she was still recovering from. It felt like ground she had covered. Solid. Hers. She put her phone in her pocket. She walked down the last 3 steps. She kept going. There is a kind of distance that does not show up on any map. It is not measured in city blocks or elevator floors. It cannot be calculated by the number of months between one version of a life and another. It lives in the space between who a person is required to be before anyone is paying attention and who they become the moment something asks them to choose quietly, without an audience, in a room where the only witness is their own reflection in a darkened window. Most people will never know they passed through that moment. They will simply continue. The choice will have been made and unmade and made again before they had language for it. But some people know. Think about the buildings you move through without thinking. The office tower you walk into every morning, past the person with the cleaning cart, past the woman refilling the paper towels in the lobby restroom, past the man emptying the wastebasket beside the elevator. You do not learn their names. You do not wonder what they studied before circumstance redirected them. You do not ask what they carry home at the end of a shift that began before you arrived and will end long after you have forgotten the building exists. You are not cruel. You are simply moving. Most of us are simply moving. But somewhere, in one of those buildings, in one of those carts, in one of those quiet circuits, through hallways that belong to everyone and no one, something is being held together by a person you have never looked at directly. That is not a metaphor. That is architecture. The story you just heard was built on a single moment. A person found something that did not belong to them, understood exactly what it was, and put it back. Not because she did not need it. She needed it more than the person who left it behind. Not because she did not know what she could do with it. She knew precisely. Not because she was unaware that no one would have seen her take it. She understood cameras, angles, evidence, the specific blindness of institutions. She put it back because of who she was deciding to be. In the dark, at 2 in the morning, when the only thing watching was a light she never noticed. That decision did not immediately change her life. Integrity rarely works on an immediate timeline. It works the way water works on stone, not with force, but with consistency, with direction, with the patience to keep moving, even when the surface looks unchanged. What changed first was small. A name on a file, a call made, a folder opened after 6 years, a seat at a table where she had previously only cleaned beneath it. What changed last was the hardest thing, to measure the distance inside a person between the wound and the ground they stand on, between what was done to them and what they choose to carry forward. That distance, when it finally closes, does not announce itself. It arrives like a morning you almost missed because you were looking at your phone. It is only later, standing on a set of courthouse steps with sunlight on your face and a message from your child in your hand, that you understand something healed, without your permission, without ceremony, simply because you kept going in the right direction long enough. There is someone in your life who is simply moving through it without anyone watching. Maybe they clean the building where you work. Maybe they sit 3 rows ahead of you on the morning train. Maybe they are raising children in a neighborhood. The city stopped paying attention to studying documents at a kitchen table. After midnight, practicing patience with a precision that would put most formal institutions to shame. You will probably not know what they are carrying. You will probably not ask, but consider for a moment what it would mean to see them. Not to fix anything, not to offer something, just to let your attention rest on them long enough to acknowledge that they are there, that they are doing something real in a world that has decided their effort is background noise. That acknowledgement costs nothing. And it is not nothing. If this story stayed with you, if you found yourself thinking about someone you have been moving past without seeing, then it has done what it was made to do. You do not need to do anything dramatic. You do not need to change a life today. But if there is a name that has come to mind while you were reading, a person who puts things back, who holds things together, who keeps going without anyone in the gallery, consider telling them. Not with a grand gesture, just with the particular attention of someone who finally stopped moving long enough to look. That is the whole thing. That has always been the whole thing.